Life had become a whirlwind of chaos, and despair had settled into my bones like an unshakable shadow. I was lost, unable to see a way out of the mess I had found myself in. That was until I stumbled upon an ad that seemed like a lifeline, a simple job as an assistant to an elderly woman. It felt like the perfect opportunity to steady myself, to find some semblance of normalcy while I pieced my life back together. Her name was Mrs. Clara, and she responded to my inquiry almost immediately, inviting me to her home for my first day of work. When I arrived, the house stood isolated, far from the noise of the city. It had an eerie charm, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, but I brushed it off. I needed this chance, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. Mrs. Clara greeted me with a warm smile when she opened the door. She looked frail, but her eyes were sharp, piercing through me as if she could see every secret I'd ever tried to hide. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice carrying a strange, almost musical quality that mingled with the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. I accepted, not wanting to offend her, even though I wasn't much of a tea drinker. The tea tasted odd, bitter yet warm, and as I sipped it, the room began to blur. My body grew heavy, and before I could react, everything went dark. The last thing I remember was the faint, almost pitying smile on Mrs. Clara's face as I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I was in a cold, damp basement. My wrists were bound by chains that dug into my skin, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. The only sound was the distant drip of water. Panic surged through me as I struggled against the chains, but they held fast. That's when I heard her footsteps. Mrs. Clara descended the stairs with an unsettling calm, her icy voice cutting through the silence. "Welcome back, my dear," she said, her tone sending a chill down my spine. "You have a task to complete." She handed me a set of tools and some wooden planks. "Build your own coffin," she ordered, her smile twisting into something sinister. My heart raced as I screamed for help, but she only laughed. She pointed to a strange device strapped to my ankle and pressed a button on a remote. A jolt of electricity shot through me, pain searing every nerve. "Are you going to do what I tell you now?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with malice. Terrified, I nodded and began to work, her laughter echoing in my ears. But Mrs. Clara had no idea who she was dealing with. Before I came to the United States, I had been part of a dangerous world, one where survival meant doing whatever it took. I had left that life behind, but the skills I had learned were still there, buried deep within me. As I knelt there, assembling the coffin, I felt the weight of the screwdriver hanging from my belt. It was my way out. In one swift motion, I freed myself from the anklet and lunged at her. Despite her frail appearance, she fought with surprising strength, but I overpowered her. I fastened the device to her wrist and whispered, "Now you're going to obey me, you old witch." From that moment on, the tables turned. For 3 days, I held control over her, forcing her to ride a will that left everything to me. Over the next few months, I played the part of the devoted caretaker, earning the trust of the neighbors while Mrs. Clara became a shell of her former self. Eventually, I decided it was time to end the charade. I wheeled her up the stairs in a wheelchair, her face pale with fear as she begged for mercy. Without hesitation, I pressed the button on the remote, watching as her body convulsed in agony. When I had seen enough, I pushed the wheelchair down the stairs, the sickening crunch of her neck snapping echoing through the house. The police ruled it an accident, and soon after, I received a call from her lawyer. Mrs. Clara had left her entire estate to me. At her funeral, I played the part of the grieving caretaker, tears streaming down my face as they lowered her into the ground. But inside, I felt nothing but relief. I had survived, and I had made sure no one else would fall victim to her twisted games. Still, the darkness of my past lingers, a constant reminder of the life I tried to leave behind. No matter how far I run, it seems to follow me, a shadow I can never quite escape. I've had so many first days on the job that I've lost count. But this one was different. I was sitting at my new desk, trying to focus on the computer screen, when I noticed a red-haired guy with freckles and thick glasses lingering at the door. He looked like he was about to smile, but instead, he turned and disappeared before I could say a word. It was strange, but I brushed it off and went back to work. A few minutes later, I felt someone approaching my desk. I looked up and saw the same guy standing there, staring at me like I was some kind of science experiment. His expression was a mix of confusion and curiosity, and it made me uneasy. I tried to break the ice with a friendly good morning, but he just sighed and gave me a look that was equal parts concerned and cold. "It's my first day here," he said, his voice flat. "I guess we haven't introduced ourselves yet." His words hung in the air, awkward and heavy. I didn't know where to look, so I let my eyes wander around the room, trying to focus on anything but his piercing gaze. Sorry," I mumbled, stumbling over my words. "I didn't mean to." "You don't like talking in the mornings, do you?" he interrupted, his tone sharp. "Do you like coffee?" The question caught me off guard. His voice was serious, almost challenging, as if he was testing me. I decided to be honest. "Yeah, I like coffee when I'm working," I said, fidgeting with my fingers. "Sometimes the numbers can get overwhelming." He didn't laugh or even crack a smile. His expression stayed blank, like he was carrying some invisible weight. For a moment, I wondered what his deal was. There was nothing particularly charming about him, but his green eyes held a strange intensity that I couldn't ignore. "Would you mind getting us some cups?" he asked, his tone slightly softer this time. Sure," I replied, though I wasn't sure why I agreed. He wasn't my boss, and it felt odd to do a favor for someone I'd just met. As I stood up, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. It left a knot in my stomach, but I decided to play along. "Do you know where the cups are?" he asked as I headed toward the kitchen. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Rob and I used to share coffee in the mornings. It was kind of our ritual." His expression shifted slightly, and for a moment, he looked almost sympathetic. "Rob died of a heart attack a few weeks ago," he said quietly. "That's his desk you're sitting at." The air grew heavy, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I muttered an apology, but he just nodded and asked me to make him a coffee, no milk, and light on the sweetener. His tone was calculated, and it left me feeling uneasy. As I brewed the coffee, I couldn't help but wonder why he seemed so burdened. It was like he carried the weight of Rob's death on his shoulders. I'd only been at this job for 3 weeks, and while my friend had encouraged me to take it, I wasn't sure I fit in yet. The office felt tense, like everyone was walking on eggshells. When I returned with the coffee, I nearly bumped into a man in the hallway. "Good morning," I said politely, holding the cups carefully. "Morning," he replied, barely glancing at me. He took one of the cups, sipped it, and walked off without another word. I stood there, holding the other cup, feeling like I'd just been dismissed. I followed him back to the office, my mind racing. When I opened the door, the red-haired guy was on the phone, his expression sharp and suspicious. "Who are you, and what are you doing at my desk?" he demanded, his voice cold. The man I'd just met in the hallway looked at him, and in that moment, a wave of horror washed over me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of setup? Was I being used as a pawn in some twisted game? Before I could process what was happening, the red-haired guy gasped, clutching his chest. He collapsed to the floor, writhing in pain. I froze, my heart pounding as I watched him struggle. The coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. The man from the hallway turned to me, his smile chilling. "I'll send your pay," he said coldly, picking up his bag from the desk. He walked out, leaving me standing there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. In a matter of minutes, I'd gone from being the new employee to feeling like my life was in someone else's hands. The office, which had seemed so ordinary just moments ago, now felt like a trap. I didn't know who to trust or what was real. All I knew was that I'd stumbled into something far darker than I could have imagined. I've been working at a local store called City Art for over a year now. It's close to my apartment, which makes it a convenient job, and I've really enjoyed it. The best part has been getting to know my coworkers and making friends. My main role is in the clothing department, where I handle all sorts of tasks. It's usually pretty relaxed, especially compared to the busy grocery section. One day, about 4 months into the job, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was in the women's section, organizing clothes that had been misplaced. The store wasn't crowded, so I was just going about my usual routine when a tall guy approached me. I assumed he was a customer who needed help, so I greeted him with a smile and asked if I could assist him. Instead of answering, he just stared at me with this unsettling grin. After a moment, he said, "Yeah, you can help me by going out with me tonight." I laughed nervously, not because I was interested, I wasn't, but because I didn't feel threatened yet. To brush him off, I told him I had a boyfriend, even though it wasn't true. I've always found that to be an easy way to turn someone down without causing a scene. But he didn't buy it. "No, you don't," he said, his tone confident. I insisted that I did and tried to change the subject by asking if he needed help finding anything. His response sent a chill down my spine. "Yeah, directions to your house." I laughed again, hoping he was just joking, but the situation was getting weirder by the second. I told him I had a lot of work to do and wished him a good day, then quickly walked away to another part of the clothing department. It's a big area, so I thought I could lose him easily. But as I moved, I realized he was following me. I stopped and turned to face him. "Why are you following me?" "You're scaring me," I said, trying to sound firm. He held up his hands like he meant no harm and walked away. I felt a wave of relief, but the encounter left me shaken. I'd dealt with flirtatious customers before, but this guy was on another level. A few hours later, I thought the whole thing was behind me until I saw him again. He was still in the store, lurking around like he hadn't left. I couldn't believe it. He'd been there for hours. Every time I glanced his way, he ducked behind a rack of clothes, like he was trying to hide. It was unnerving. I decided to move to the grocery section to avoid him, but to my surprise, he showed up there too. This time, he stared at me for a moment before disappearing into the aisles. That's when I knew I needed a break. I called my supervisor on the walkie-talkie and told him I was taking my break early. The break room was at the back of the store, and as I walked there, I couldn't stop thinking about how bizarre the whole situation was. Did this guy really think he could just follow me around like that? I hoped he'd realize I was gone and leave. I took a longer break than usual, partly because I was scared to go back out and run into him again. If I saw him, I knew I'd have to report him to security, and I didn't want to deal with that. But I also knew I couldn't avoid it forever. When I finally went back to the clothing department, I didn't see him anywhere. Still, I stayed on high alert, constantly looking over my shoulder. Thankfully, I didn't see him for the rest of my shift, which was about 2 more hours. I went home that night feeling relieved, but still uneasy. A week later, I was back at work, organizing clothes during a quiet evening shift. It was almost closing time, and the store was nearly empty. Suddenly, my walkie-talkie crackled to life. Someone called me, asking me to switch to Channel 3, which we used for private communication. They said they needed me at the front desk urgently. I confirmed and headed to the back of the store, a place I didn't go to often. The atmosphere was eerily quiet, and I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. When I switched to Channel 3, I heard my own voice echoing back at me. I called out, asking where they were, but there was no response. Then I heard a voice near one of the doors leading outside. The door was open, and as I peeked out, I saw him, the same guy, hiding behind a shelf. My heart raced as I realized he'd been the one calling me on the walkie-talkie. "Was that you calling me?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward me. I stepped back, but he was fast. Before I could react, he grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the door. I screamed, but I knew no one could hear me in that part of the store. Just then, the doors to the sales area opened, and my coworker Amy appeared. "Help!" I yelled. The man let go of me and bolted outside. I ran to Amy, shaking, and told her everything. She looked at me with concern and explained that she'd heard the guy calling me on the walkie-talkie. Something about it had seemed off to her, so she decided to investigate. We called the police, but the situation was complicated. The man had gotten hold of a walkie-talkie on the same frequency as ours, and there wasn't much they could do to track him down. Still, I was grateful that Amy had shown up when she did. I continued working at City Art for a few more months, but thankfully, I never saw that stranger again. Sometimes, while organizing clothes or chatting with my coworkers, I think back to that day. It was a terrifying experience, but it taught me to always trust my instincts and stay aware of my surroundings. Life went on, and I decided to focus on the good moments, leaving the madness behind me. I work as a security guard for a mid-sized office building right in the heart of the city. Crime rates around here are pretty high, so break-ins and thefts aren't uncommon. Most businesses in the area have beefed up their security, but it doesn't always stop determined thieves. Normally, I have a coworker with me during my shifts, but this month I was flying solo while the company trained a new hire. Being alone wasn't so bad, it was quieter, though it made staying awake a bit harder. Still, I didn't mind. Sometimes having a partner could be more trouble than it was worth, depending on who it was. About 2 weeks into my solo shifts, something unusual happened. I was patrolling the parking lot around 1 a.m. when I noticed 2 guys standing across the street. They were lingering in the shadows, just watching. I couldn't tell if they were looking at the building or at me, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. By the time I made my next round, they were gone. I made a mental note of it, but didn't think much of it at the time. The rest of the night was quiet, and I clocked out at 6 a.m. with nothing out of the ordinary to report. The next few days were uneventful, but then, at the end of the week, I saw them again. They were in the same spot, standing in the dark and staring in my direction. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. To make my presence known, I stayed on that side of the building, pacing back and forth for about 5 minutes. Eventually, they walked away. I tried to get a better look at them, but from that distance, all I could make out were their silhouettes. I stayed outside for another 10 or 15 minutes to make sure they didn't come back, then headed inside. With them gone, I figured it was a good time to take my lunch break. The break room was at the far end of the hallway in the back of the building. I sat down, started eating, and scrolled through my phone when I suddenly heard a noise. It was faint, but it was enough to make me pause. I put my phone down and listened, but everything seemed quiet. After a few seconds, I got up and walked to the doorway, peering into the hallway. I stood there for about 30 seconds, but there was nothing. I shrugged it off, figuring it was probably nothing, and went back to finish my lunch. Afterward, I went to the security office and checked the system for any alerts or flags. Everything looked normal. Usually, this was the part of the night where I'd just sit in my chair and wait for something to happen, but something felt off. I wasn't nervous, exactly, more curious. The noise I'd heard earlier stuck in my mind, and I decided to do another round, just to be thorough. I started outside, walking around the building. It was quiet, just the hum of the street lights and the occasional distant sound of traffic. No one was around. I went back inside and began walking through the hallways. Normally, unless there was an alert, I wouldn't check every inch of the building. I'd just walk up and down the main hallway to make sure nothing was out of place. The hallway was long, shaped like an L, with the main door on one side and a door to a small stairwell on the other. The stairwell led to an old emergency exit, a heavy metal door that wasn't connected to the security system. To secure it, the company had installed a massive padlock and bolted it shut. As far as I knew, it was useless and hadn't been touched in years. But when I reached the end of the hallway and looked through the door window into the stairwell, my heart dropped. The padlock was snapped in half, lying on the ground, and the metal door had been forced open. My stomach churned as I hurried back to the security office. If someone had broken in, how had they slipped past me? I should have seen or heard something. I pulled up the security footage and started scanning through the tapes. What I saw made my blood run cold. After the 2 men left the street, they had circled around to the back of the building. They broke the padlock, forced the door open, and slipped inside. While I was in the break room eating my lunch, one of them was literally on the other side of the door, just a few feet away from me. The noise I'd heard earlier? That was one of them bumping into a desk while trying to hide. When I went back outside to do my rounds, they made their escape. The footage was grainy, but it was clear that both men were armed either with large knives or possibly small firearms. It sent a chill down my spine to think they were prepared to take me down if I had caught them. I called the police and handed over the tapes, but nothing ever came of it. The footage wasn't great, and the men had their faces covered. The company reported that several hard drives and files had been stolen, and they seemed pretty shaken up about it. To this day, there's been no further information about the men or their motives. That night was a wake-up call for me. It's easy to fall into a routine, especially during long, quiet shifts. But after that, I made sure to stay extra vigilant, no matter how boring the night seemed. You never know what, or who, might be lurking just out of sight. During my last years of high school, I worked as a delivery driver for a popular fast food chain in my hometown. It was an easy job, and most of my friends worked there too, but the managers always scheduled us on different shifts to keep us from goofing off. It was frustrating, but at least I had some cash in my pocket. Most of my shifts were uneventful, but one night stands out in my memory, a night that taught me to always trust my instincts. It was a weekend, and I was on the closing shift, working until 10 p.m. The kitchen was slammed with orders, and I was in a rhythm: grab the bag, jump in the car, deliver, repeat. I wasn't sure of the exact time, but it was around 9 p.m. when an unusual order came in. I grabbed the bag, checked the GPS, and headed out. As I drove, I realized I was going in a direction I didn't usually take for deliveries. The road was familiar, but there weren't many houses around, just trees and empty fields. It felt off, but I kept going. The GPS told me I was a minute away from the destination, but when I looked around, all I saw was darkness and trees. No houses, no lights, just an empty road. I pulled over, confused, and called the customer. The phone rang several times before they finally answered. "Hi, I'm at the address you gave me, but I don't see any houses around. Can you confirm the address?" I asked, hoping I'd made a mistake. The voice on the other end repeated the same address I had on the GPS. Then, they said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Wait, I think I see you." I looked ahead and saw a figure waving at me from the side of the road. My stomach dropped, but I rolled down the window as he approached. He apologized, saying his house was hard to find, and pointed down a dirt path behind him. "It's just at the end of that road," he said. I handed him the bag, forcing a smile, and tried to stay calm. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him still standing there, watching me. That's when I knew something was wrong. A few moments later, my car started shaking and leaning to one side. I pulled over and got out to check. The front right tire was flat. My mind raced as I connected the dots. I looked back down the road and saw the figure walking toward me. Without thinking, I jumped back into the car and locked the doors. My heart pounded as I debated whether to risk driving on a flat tire. Just then, a truck pulled up behind me. Two guys got out and asked if I needed help. I glanced back and saw the figure from earlier turn around and disappear into the darkness. The strangers stayed with me until roadside assistance arrived, and we called the police. When they checked the order details, they confirmed the name and address were fake. I never found out what that guy's intentions were, but I had a sinking feeling it wasn't just a simple robbery. Whatever he had planned, I was lucky to escape unharmed. That night taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes, things aren't what they seem, and it's always worth listening to your gut. Not every shift was exciting, but every now and then, life had a way of throwing surprises my way. Used to work as a security guard for a small warehouse in my city. It was an overnight shift, which wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but the pay was better than most other gigs like it. The warehouse itself wasn't huge or fancy, but the company stored expensive tech equipment, so they needed 24/7 surveillance. My job was pretty straightforward: watch the cameras, do regular patrols, and occasionally fill out reports. Most nights were uneventful, but there was one night that still gives me chills when I think about it. It was a rainy night, the kind where the rain comes down in sheets and thunder rumbles in the distance. Honestly, nights like that usually felt more relaxing to me. The weather kept most people indoors, so I figured the chances of anything happening were slim. I arrived at the warehouse around 10:30 p.m., chatted with the closing shift workers as they left, and settled in for the night. From 10:30 p.m. to 6 a.m., the place was mine to watch over. The warehouse was usually quiet, with just the occasional creak of the building settling. But that night, the rain pounding on the roof drowned out almost everything else. About 2 hours into my shift, I decided to take a break from staring at the camera feeds and do a routine patrol. I walked down to the far end of the warehouse, where most of the storage was, and started making my way back. That's when I heard it, a soft beeping sound echoing through the hallway. It was coming from the security room. I hurried over and checked the monitor. The alert was for a latch sensor on the back door, which meant someone had tried to open it. I pulled up the live camera feed for that area, but there was no one there. After a minute, I decided to check the door myself, thinking maybe the sensor was faulty or the rain had triggered it somehow. I disabled the alarm and opened the door, peering out into the alley behind the warehouse. It was empty, just rain-soaked pavement and darkness. The door itself seemed fine, and the sensor had never given me trouble before. I looked around one more time, then shut and locked the door. Even though I didn't see anything suspicious, I still had to file a report since the alarm had been triggered. I was back in the security office, filling out the paperwork, when a loud thud echoed through the building. I jumped out of my chair, my heart racing, and stared down the hallway. I couldn't tell where the sound had come from or what had caused it. I stepped out into the hallway, listening for any more noises, but all I could hear was the rain on the roof. I started walking cautiously through the warehouse, checking the shelves for any fallen boxes or signs of damage. As I got closer to the front of the building, the sound of the rain grew louder. I turned the corner and froze. The front door was wide open, and there were wet footprints on the floor. Someone had come inside. I sprinted back to the security room, locked myself in, and hit the emergency button to call the police. As I waited, I heard a few more thuds from somewhere in the building, then silence. The police arrived quickly, and I met them at the front door to explain what had happened. 2 officers went inside to search the warehouse while I stayed with another to give my report. A few minutes later, they came back with a man in handcuffs. They said they'd found him hiding behind some boxes in the storage area, clutching a hammer. As they led him past me, he locked eyes with me, his gaze cold and unsettling. It sent a shiver down my spine. The police later told me the man was heavily under the influence of drugs and couldn't give a clear reason for breaking into the warehouse. They didn't know what his intentions were, but with a hammer in his hands and his state of mind, it was anyone's guess what could have happened. Thankfully, he's still behind bars. I don't work overnight shifts at that warehouse anymore, but that night still haunts me, especially on rainy nights when the sound of the rain makes it hard to hear anything else. It's a reminder that even on the quietest nights, you never really know what, or who, might be lurking just out of sight.